It began as a simple rental agreement, one that should have offered peace and stability. But within months, it turned into a nightmare no landlord could have imagined. The quiet suburban duplex that once echoed with laughter became a battleground of lies, threats, and relentless harassment. Neighbors whispered. Police lights flickered. Anonymous complaints piled up like weapons, each one designed to destroy a man's reputation and livelihood. He tried to stay calm, tried to play by the rules, until one final act crossed the line. That was the moment everything changed, when justice stopped being a hope and became a reckoning. Before the chaos began, Thomas Greer's life was steady, predictable, and quietly content. A 46-year-old landlord with a calm temperament and a reputation for fairness, he managed 3 small rental properties on the outskirts of Maple Ridge, a quiet suburban neighborhood lined with oak trees, trimmed hedges, and the faint sound of lawnmowers humming on Saturday mornings. He wasn't wealthy, but he took pride in his work. Every rent payment helped him care for his aging mother and keep the roofs over his tenants' heads safe, maintained, and welcoming. Thomas lived alone in a modest 2-story home that stood at the end of a cul-de-sac. The kind of place where mailboxes leaned slightly, kids rode bikes after dinner, and neighbors waved even if they didn't know your name. His days followed a comforting rhythm. Morning coffee on the porch, a quick drive to check on his properties, paperwork in the afternoons, and evenings spent watching old detective shows with his dog, Milo. There was a peace to it all. To those who knew him, Thomas was more than a landlord. He was the type who fixed leaky faucets without charging extra, who brought groceries for his elderly tenants during the pandemic, and who forgave late rent if someone was struggling. His philosophy was simple: treat people with decency, and they'll respect you in return. But as he would soon learn, that belief doesn't hold up when decency meets manipulation. The turning point, the moment the balance of his calm existence began to crack, came with a single vacancy notice. His longtime tenant in Unit 2, a retired nurse named Evelyn, decided to move closer to her grandchildren. Thomas posted an online listing for the apartment: 2-bedroom duplex, quiet area, great neighbors, recently renovated kitchen. Within a week, he received dozens of inquiries. Among them was one that seemed normal. A woman named Rachel Quinn, early 30s, soft-spoken in her emails, claimed she worked remotely in graphic design. She sent her application the same day, professional, neat, and complete with references that checked out. Her tone was polite, even friendly. When they met in person, she seemed ideal, respectful, articulate, and enthusiastic about the quiet neighborhood. Thomas, ever cautious, ran her background check. No evictions. No complaints. No reason to doubt. Within 2 weeks, Rachel moved in with her young son, Ethan. At first, everything went smoothly. Rent came on time, her emails were brief and professional, and Thomas felt lucky. After all, good tenants were the heart of his business. For a while, life returned to its usual calm. But beneath the surface, tension was brewing, quiet, invisible, waiting for a spark. The first subtle signs appeared after a few weeks. A small complaint about the thermostat. A follow-up about strange noises coming from the walls. Then another, this time about unfair maintenance delays. Each issue seemed minor, nothing out of the ordinary for a landlord. But the pattern was unusual. Her tone shifted. The once polite tenant began sending long, accusatory messages late at night, copied to the property management office and sometimes even the city housing department. Thomas responded patiently, documenting every message and fixing each supposed problem. He made sure to handle it by the book. Still, something about Rachel's behavior unsettled him. She was always watching, always waiting for a misstep, as if her goal wasn't comfort, but control. Then came the neighbors' whispers. A family next door told Thomas they'd seen police cars outside Rachel's unit one night. Another claimed she'd been shouting at someone on the phone in the driveway, accusing the landlord of spying on her. Thomas brushed it off at first, assuming it was an exaggeration. People sometimes misread situations, and rumors in small communities grew like weeds. But that illusion of normalcy shattered one morning in early spring. Thomas arrived to inspect a minor plumbing issue, something Rachel herself had requested, and found a handwritten note taped to the door in large black letters. "Enter this property and I'll sue you for trespassing." It was the first time he felt real unease. Not just as a landlord, but as a man standing in front of a door that no longer felt safe to knock on. Rachel's tone in emails turned hostile soon after. She accused him of neglect, discrimination, and harassment, words that could destroy a reputation if spoken to the wrong person. Thomas, careful as ever, responded formally and kept records of everything. Yet each reply seemed to fuel her anger. She began spreading rumors to other tenants, suggesting Thomas had hidden cameras, that he'd been overcharging rent illegally, that he was trying to force single mothers out. The community began to shift. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Tenants asked uneasy questions. A few even hinted at breaking their leases. For the first time, Thomas realized the true danger wasn't a broken pipe or a missed payment. It was the story Rachel was weaving, one where he was the villain. That's when he reached out to a lawyer, just for advice. The attorney told him something chilling: document everything. Tenants like this, they're building a case long before you know what's happening. That sentence haunted him. By summer, the situation had worsened. Rachel began refusing entry for repairs, claiming harassment. She sent letters to the housing board alleging unsafe living conditions. Every accusation came with new demands: rent reductions, service discounts, even compensation for emotional distress. Thomas tried mediation, offered solutions, and even considered letting her out of her lease early. But she refused. She didn't want out. She wanted him broken. One afternoon, he discovered something alarming. She had posted about him online. A long, dramatic post accusing him of being a predatory landlord. It included his name, property address, and fabricated details about abuse of power. Within hours, it spread through local groups. Strangers left hateful comments. Someone even vandalized his mailbox, painting the word slumlord across it in red. The emotional weight of it all began to suffocate him. Sleep vanished. Calls from tenants filled him with dread. Every knock at the door felt like a threat. Milo, his dog, sensed it too, pacing more, barking at shadows. The house that once felt safe now echoed with anxiety. Yet through it all, Thomas held on to one belief: truth had to win eventually. He'd done nothing wrong. He had proof, witnesses, and records. If this escalated, the truth would clear his name. But as the weeks passed, even that hope began to dim. Rachel had started contacting local reporters, pushing a story about tenant abuse. And then came the notice from the city, a formal complaint requiring Thomas to appear at a housing tribunal. The allegations listed were extreme: retaliation, negligence, harassment. It felt surreal. His quiet life had turned into a public spectacle. Standing in his kitchen, holding the letter, Thomas felt the first wave of something darker, not just fear, but injustice. He knew he was being set up. He just didn't know how far it would go. And as the sun dipped behind the rooftops of Maple Ridge that night, he looked out the window and saw Rachel standing in her driveway, arms crossed, watching his house. It was then he understood, this wasn't just a tenant dispute. It was a war. By the end of that week, Thomas Greer's calm, orderly world had completely unraveled. What had begun as an uncomfortable situation was quickly spiraling into something far worse, something calculated, vindictive, and disturbingly personal. Rachel Quinn wasn't just an angry tenant anymore. She was a strategist, a performer in a drama she had authored herself, and Thomas had become the unwilling antagonist in her story. It started small, almost invisible to anyone outside the situation. She began refusing to pay full rent, sending partial payments with lengthy explanations filled with exaggerated claims. The walls leak air, the floors are warped, the noise upstairs is unbearable. Every message was time-stamped late at night, long paragraphs written with the precision of someone preparing for battle. Thomas tried to remain calm. He documented each message, responded professionally, and even hired independent inspectors to verify her claims. Each report came back the same: property in good condition. No violations found. But evidence didn't seem to matter. Rachel was never after the truth, she was after control. The first true escalation came in the form of a letter, not from Rachel, but from a tenant advocacy group downtown. The letter accused Thomas of harassment, creating unsafe living conditions, and violating tenant privacy. It demanded immediate corrective action, or they would pursue public exposure and legal recourse. Thomas's hands shook as he read it. The accusations were false, but the threat was real. His lawyer assured him this kind of intimidation wasn't uncommon, that some tenants used advocacy networks to pressure landlords into settlements. But this wasn't about money anymore. Thomas could sense something deeper, a personal vendetta. A week later, it became impossible to ignore. Someone began filming him. At first, he noticed a car idling across from one of his properties with a phone pointed in his direction. Then Rachel herself started recording every interaction. When he came to check on maintenance or deliver notices, she stood outside with her phone raised, narrating loudly about illegal entry and evidence for the case. Soon, those videos began surfacing online. Edited out of context, accompanied by captions that painted Thomas as a ruthless landlord bullying a single mother. The comments were venomous, hundreds of strangers accusing him of exploitation, demanding he be shut down. That's when the vandalism began. His mailbox wasn't just defaced anymore. It was destroyed, smashed in with a hammer one morning before sunrise. The tires on his truck were slashed. Someone threw paint across his property sign. Thomas filed police reports, but each time, officers simply shrugged. Probably kids, one said. These things happen. But Thomas knew. This wasn't random. The stress began to affect every part of his life. His other tenants, once friendly, trusting people, grew distant. A few stopped returning his calls altogether. One family even moved out early, citing uncomfortable community tension. His income dropped. His mother, hearing about his troubles, worried constantly. Even Milo, his loyal dog, seemed to sense the tension, whimpering when Thomas paced the house late at night. Sleep turned to restlessness. Restlessness turned to paranoia. He began to dread his own phone vibrating. Every email could be another false accusation. Every knock on the door could be another confrontation. And then came the first legal notice, a summons for the housing tribunal hearing. Rachel had filed a formal complaint for emotional and financial damages caused by landlord harassment. The date was set for 2 months later. Thomas's lawyer, David, immediately began preparing a defense. Together, they compiled photos, inspection records, maintenance logs, rent receipts, and written correspondence. The evidence was airtight. "You'll win this," David said confidently. "She's making things up. The board will see that." But Thomas had learned one painful truth by now. In situations like this, logic didn't always matter. Rachel had mastered the art of emotional manipulation. She cried in public, spun stories online, and gathered sympathy from neighbors who didn't know the facts. The media got wind of it. A local reporter reached out, asking for a statement about alleged landlord abuse. Thomas refused to comment, but silence only fueled speculation. Soon, Rachel's narrative had spread far beyond Maple Ridge. She had turned a quiet suburban rental dispute into a public crusade, and Thomas into the villain. One morning, he arrived at his property to find city inspectors already there. They said they'd received an anonymous complaint about unsafe electrical wiring. The report led to temporary citations, nothing serious, but enough to stain his record. It felt like a trap tightening around him. Each week brought something new, a petty fine, a rumor, a social media post. Someone even left a fake eviction notice, taped to his own front door, mocking him. Thomas took photos, filed reports, tried to stay composed, but inside, the stress hollowed him out. He had never felt this powerless before. Then came the worst blow. Rachel's lawyer filed for a restraining order, claiming Thomas had been stalking and intimidating her. The claims were baseless, but it forced Thomas to temporarily stop visiting his own property. For the first time in 20 years, he couldn't legally set foot on land he owned. His tenants began whispering that something must be true, otherwise, why would the court approve it? The isolation deepened. Rachel, meanwhile, flaunted her power. She threw small parties, loud enough for neighbors to notice, always with music and laughter echoing through the street, a taunt to the man she'd trapped. She filmed new videos, mocking Thomas indirectly, making veiled references about justice for tenants. Each night, Thomas sat by his window, staring into the dark, wondering how everything had fallen apart so fast. He began replaying every decision, every moment of kindness he'd ever shown her. Was it a mistake to trust her? Should he have screened her more carefully? Should he have seen the signs sooner? But no matter how many questions he asked himself, the same conclusion echoed back. He was being destroyed not by what he did, but by what she said. As the tribunal date approached, his anxiety turned to dread. The hearing would be public. Anyone could attend. And Rachel, he knew, would make it a spectacle. On the morning of the hearing, Thomas dressed carefully. Navy suit, pressed shirt. He rehearsed his points in the mirror, took deep breaths, and reminded himself of the facts. The truth would speak louder than lies. But the moment he entered the hearing room, he realized truth alone might not be enough. Rachel was already there, sitting beside her lawyer. She looked nothing like the unhinged woman who had harassed him for months. Today she appeared fragile, sympathetic, her makeup carefully smudged as if she'd been crying. Her lawyer, confident and composed, handed out thick binders of printed evidence, screenshots, letters, photos, all twisted fragments of the story. Across the table, Thomas's pulse quickened. The hearing began with opening statements. Rachel's lawyer painted her as a victim of sustained psychological torment, claiming Thomas had weaponized his authority as a landlord to intimidate her. Every accusation was carefully phrased, dramatic enough to draw sympathy from the board members. Thomas wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the rules required he stay silent until it was his turn. Each minute felt like an hour. Then Rachel began to cry. Tears streamed down her face as she described living in fear of her landlord, how she jumped at every sound, how she felt unsafe in her own home. Her performance was flawless. Even one of the board members looked visibly moved. Thomas's lawyer whispered, "Don't react." But inside, he was breaking. When it was finally his turn to speak, Thomas laid out his evidence methodically. Inspection reports, email logs, photographs, police complaints, a detailed record of months of harassment. But as he spoke, he noticed the board's expressions, polite, but distant. Facts didn't grip hearts the way tears did. Then came the final blow. Rachel's lawyer presented a recording, a short, edited clip of Thomas's voice saying, "You'll regret this." Out of context, it sounded threatening. In reality, it had been part of a completely different conversation about maintenance delays. But the damage was done. Gasps filled the room. Thomas's lawyer demanded the full recording, but Rachel's team claimed the rest had been accidentally lost. By the time the hearing ended, the board announced their decision would be under review. The words felt hollow. Thomas knew what that meant: uncertainty, limbo, and more waiting while his reputation rotted. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting. Cameras flashed. Someone shouted, "Thomas, are you guilty?" He said nothing. He couldn't. His throat was dry, his heart pounding. That night, he didn't go home. He drove aimlessly for hours, through empty highways and quiet streets, until he reached the edge of town. There, parked under a flickering streetlight, he finally let himself feel the weight of it all. The humiliation, the helplessness, the loss of everything he'd built. He had tried to do everything right, legally, morally, professionally, and still he was being crushed under lies. The next morning, he woke to another headline: Landlord under investigation for tenant harassment. His business inquiries vanished overnight. His phone stopped ringing. The silence was suffocating. A week later, he found a notice from the bank. His rental insurance provider had suspended coverage pending investigation. It was the final straw. Thomas had been cornered. He wasn't just fighting to prove innocence anymore. He was fighting to survive. For days, he withdrew from everything. Calls went unanswered. Meals untouched. He scrolled endlessly through the online posts about him, hateful comments, memes, videos mocking his downfall. But amid the noise, one message stood out. A private email from one of his former tenants, a young man named Luis who had moved out months earlier. The message was short but life-changing. Mr. Greer, I think I know what Rachel's been doing. I have proof. Call me. It was the first flicker of hope Thomas had felt in months. Luis explained that Rachel had approached several tenants, promising them rent discounts if they submitted fake complaints about Thomas. She had been building her evidence long before the tribunal, a coordinated smear campaign. Luis had refused, but others had agreed, afraid of retaliation or tempted by her offers. He even had screenshots of her messages, clear proof of manipulation. Thomas's pulse raced. For the first time, the scales could finally tip in his favor. He forwarded everything to his lawyer. David's reply came within minutes. This changes everything. That night, Thomas sat in silence, staring at the glowing screen of his laptop, rereading the evidence over and over. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from a strange mix of anger and relief. For months, he had been painted as the villain. Now, for the first time, he had the truth on his side. But he also knew something else. Exposing Rachel wouldn't be easy. She had built her image carefully, manipulating perception at every turn. If he wanted justice, he'd have to fight fire with fire. As he looked out the window, the streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, illuminating the quiet neighborhood that had once felt safe. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about reclaiming his life. The war Rachel started wasn't over, it was about to explode. The tribunal reconvened 3 weeks later. The tension in the air was almost tangible, thick enough to taste. What had started as a routine landlord-tenant hearing had grown into something far larger, a spectacle of accusation, reputation, and revenge. Local reporters filled the hall, murmuring about the case that divided the neighborhood. The public gallery was packed, with faces Thomas didn't recognize but who looked at him with open hostility. He could almost feel their judgment, their curiosity, their hunger for scandal. This time, though, Thomas wasn't the same man who had walked into the first hearing. Gone was the defeated, hollow-eyed landlord crushed under the weight of manipulation. In his place stood someone sharpened by pain, calm, composed, but carrying the quiet fury of a man who had been pushed too far. Rachel arrived late, flanked by her lawyer and holding a cup of coffee like she owned the room. She wore a soft beige coat and heavy mascara, her appearance calculated to evoke sympathy. She glanced at Thomas once, her lips curling into the faintest smirk, as if daring him to crumble again. But she didn't know that this time, Thomas had come armed. When the board called the session to order, Rachel's lawyer began confidently, reiterating claims of harassment and intimidation. His voice rose and fell in practiced rhythm, painting Rachel once again as the victim of a ruthless landlord who had abused his position of power. Each accusation hit like a drumbeat, deliberate, rehearsed. Thomas sat still, his eyes fixed on the documents before him. The noise of the crowd faded. He wasn't listening to the lawyer anymore. He was waiting. When it was finally his turn, his lawyer, David, rose and began speaking with a measured calm that drew every eye in the room. Mr. Greer has been accused of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of authority, he began. But today we will show evidence that these accusations were not only false, they were manufactured. A murmur spread across the room. Rachel's expression faltered for the first time. David opened his laptop, connecting it to the projector. The lights dimmed slightly, and the first screenshot appeared on the large screen, a message thread from Rachel to a former tenant. The words were clear. If you write a complaint about Thomas, I'll reduce your rent by 25%. Just say he yelled at you or ignored maintenance. Gasps filled the room. The next slide showed another thread, this time between Rachel and a different tenant. Don't worry, it doesn't have to be true. Everyone knows how landlords are. They'll believe us. The room went dead silent. Thomas's lawyer continued, showing message after message, each one a new nail in the coffin Rachel had built for herself. There were even audio clips, recordings of Rachel bragging to friends about how she'd ruined Thomas's reputation. Her voice, sharp and laughing, echoed through the chamber like poison. Rachel's face drained of color. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably, whispering frantically into her ear. She shook her head, whispering back, her voice trembling now. But David wasn't done. He clicked to the next slide, a recorded video from a former tenant, Luis, giving his statement. His face filled the screen as he described how Rachel had approached him, offering money and favors to join her campaign. He explained how he refused, how he'd watched the chaos unfold, and how he couldn't stay silent anymore. The board members leaned forward. The lead member, an older woman with steel gray hair, narrowed her eyes at Rachel. Thomas didn't move. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just sat there, finally breathing evenly for the first time in months. When the presentation ended, the silence was deafening. Even the reporters had stopped typing. Rachel's lawyer stumbled through a rebuttal, claiming the evidence was taken out of context and possibly fabricated, but his voice lacked conviction. The board requested a recess. As the room emptied, Thomas stood and stepped outside for air. The hallway buzzed with whispers. Some people glanced at him with cautious sympathy, others avoided his eyes altogether. Cameras flashed again, reporters calling his name, but this time their tone was different, curious, almost apologetic. Thomas didn't answer any questions. He just leaned against the cold marble wall, feeling the weight of months of humiliation start to lift. But the battle wasn't over. When the hearing resumed, Rachel's demeanor had changed completely. The confidence, the performance, gone. She sat rigid, hands trembling, her voice barely audible as her lawyer spoke for her. The board began questioning her directly, pressing her on the messages and recordings. Her answers were vague, evasive. When confronted with undeniable evidence, she blamed hacking, context, and misunderstandings. But every word made it worse. The lead board member leaned forward, voice steady but sharp. "Ms. Quinn, do you have any proof of these claims?" Rachel stammered, eyes darting between her lawyer and the table. It was supposed to be a joke," she finally muttered. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." The board member's expression hardened. A joke that destroyed a man's livelihood? For the first time, Rachel broke. Tears welled up, but they weren't convincing anymore. Everyone could see through them now. The performance had run its course. Then, the most unexpected moment arrived. The board requested that both parties step aside while they deliberated. It took less than 20 minutes. When they returned, the lead member read the decision aloud. The board finds in favor of the landlord, Mr. Thomas Greer. The claims made against him are determined to be false and maliciously fabricated. Furthermore, evidence provided today indicates a deliberate attempt to manipulate this tribunal and defame the respondent for personal gain. A collective gasp swept through the audience. Reporters scrambled to capture every word. Rachel sat frozen, her face pale and expression blank. Her lawyer lowered his head. But the decision didn't stop there. The board announced that Rachel's tenancy would be terminated immediately and referred her conduct to law enforcement for investigation into fraud and defamation. It was an unprecedented move. The very system she had tried to exploit had turned against her. Thomas felt his chest tighten as relief flooded in, but he didn't cheer. He just exhaled, long and steady, as if releasing months of suffocating air all at once. The tribunal adjourned, but the storm was far from over. Outside, cameras swarmed him again. This time, he allowed himself to speak, his words simple but firm. "All I ever wanted was the truth to come out." Within hours, headlines exploded. Tenant exposed for false harassment claims. Landlord cleared. Evidence reveals shocking deception. Justice served in Maple Ridge housing case. The online tide shifted almost instantly. Comments that once cursed his name now praised his composure and strength. People apologized. Some defended him passionately, calling for accountability. But Thomas didn't read most of it. He'd already learned how fleeting public opinion could be. That night, he returned to his home, the first quiet evening in what felt like forever. Milo greeted him at the door, tail wagging. The silence was peaceful now, no longer heavy with dread. He poured himself a drink and sat by the window, watching the lights of the neighborhood. In the distance, he could see the property where Rachel once lived. The windows were dark. Her car was gone. Her name would soon disappear from every tenant list, every file. But her actions had left scars, not just on his reputation, but on his faith in people. Still, something inside him had shifted too. He had faced the worst, lies, public shame, and near ruin, and had survived. He had learned that sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it arrives quietly after the noise has faded. The next morning, his phone buzzed with a message from his lawyer. "It's over. She's been charged with filing false statements. You're free." Free. The word echoed in his mind like a melody he hadn't heard in years. Thomas stepped outside, feeling the crisp morning air on his face. For the first time in months, he noticed the sound of birds, the scent of cut grass, the sunlight spilling across the driveway. Simple things he'd stopped appreciating under the weight of fear. He wasn't just vindicated, he was alive again. Still, as he looked around, he couldn't help but think of all the others who might not have the means or strength to fight back like he did. How many landlords, tenants, or neighbors had their lives quietly destroyed by lies that never saw the light of truth? It was a sobering thought, and a motivation. He decided then that he wouldn't let his story be just another tabloid headline. He would share it, tell others how quickly good intentions can be twisted, how easily perception can replace truth. Because if there was one thing Thomas had learned, it was this. Justice doesn't just happen. Sometimes, you have to fight for it, bleed for it, and prove it to the world. And as the sun rose over Maple Ridge, washing the neighborhood in gold, Thomas finally smiled, not because he'd won, but because he had endured. The days that followed the tribunal verdict felt surreal to Thomas. For months, his life had been consumed by fear, tension, and public humiliation. Now there was silence, an unfamiliar calm that felt both liberating and fragile. He woke each morning half expecting another email, another false accusation, another summons. But none came. The storm had finally passed. Still, the echoes of the ordeal lingered. The first few days after the verdict, Thomas avoided leaving his house. Though the news had cleared his name, he couldn't escape the memory of how easily the community had turned against him. The same neighbors who once waved from their lawns had been the ones whispering about him, sharing rumors, feeding on lies. But time, like truth, had its own way of reshaping perception. Slowly, people began to approach him again, some awkwardly, others with visible remorse. A few left notes of apology in his mailbox, short messages scrawled on plain paper. "I'm sorry for believing what I heard. Glad justice was served." Most didn't say anything at all, but their glances were softer now, almost grateful that the chaos was over. Rachel's downfall, meanwhile, became a local cautionary tale. Within a week of the ruling, her name trended across social media, not as a victim but as a manipulator. News outlets dug deeper into her past, uncovering similar disputes from her previous residences, patterns of complaint, conflict, and manipulation. It turned out Thomas hadn't been her first target, he was just the one who finally fought back. When law enforcement formally charged her with falsifying evidence and defamation, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip again, but this time, it wasn't Thomas at the center of it. Rachel moved out under the cover of night, escorted by a moving truck and a single police car. Her once friendly neighbors watched from their porches, not offering help or sympathy. The quiet judgment that had once been aimed at Thomas now followed her instead. The board issued a public statement clearing Thomas of all wrongdoing. The local newspaper ran an article titled, "Landlord Vindicated After Ordeal," painting a detailed picture of how a single false narrative had nearly destroyed a man's career. The article quoted one of the tribunal members who admitted, "This case reminds us that justice requires evidence, not emotion." For Thomas, those words hit deep. Evidence, not emotion. That was what had saved him in the end. Weeks turned into months, and though the public noise faded, the private scars remained. The stress had left him exhausted, his health frayed. He found himself waking in the middle of the night, heart pounding, as if expecting another confrontation. Even Milo, his loyal dog, seemed to sense the residual unease. But recovery, like truth, was slow and deliberate. He began to rebuild, quietly, methodically. He repainted the apartment building's hallway, replaced the worn tiles in the entryway, and repaired the garden fence that had fallen into neglect during the chaos. Each task, no matter how small, became an act of reclamation. The property that had once felt cursed was slowly becoming his again, a symbol not of conflict, but of endurance. A few months later, Thomas received an invitation from a local property association to speak at a forum on conflict resolution and tenant rights. At first, he hesitated. The thought of revisiting the ordeal publicly made his stomach turn. But something inside him, perhaps the need to turn pain into purpose, made him accept. On the day of the event, he stood before a room full of landlords, tenants, and homeowners. The air was thick with quiet curiosity. He began to speak, not about revenge or blame, but about resilience and transparency. He shared how quickly reputations could be destroyed by unchecked rumors, how fragile trust could become when emotion overtook fairness. He spoke of evidence, patience, and the importance of not allowing anger to dictate justice. By the time he finished, the room was silent. Then applause. Not loud, but sincere. In that moment, Thomas realized that his story no longer belonged to the chaos that birthed it. It had become a lesson, a warning about how easily perception can become poison. Meanwhile, Rachel's life unraveled. Her social media accounts vanished, her job lost, her reputation reduced to fragments of online speculation. Some said she moved to another city, others claimed she tried to start over under a different name. But no one really knew for sure. What was certain, though, was that she had underestimated how fast lies could collapse once truth had a platform. For Thomas, revenge had never been his goal, but seeing her downfall brought a strange sense of balance. He didn't celebrate it, but neither did he pity her. Some lessons, he thought, are learned only when everything else is lost. With his name cleared and business stable again, Thomas returned to the rhythms of normal life. He began jogging in the mornings, taking Milo along the quiet suburban paths he had once avoided. The neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid him now nodded in greeting. The gossip had burned itself out, leaving behind something almost peaceful. Yet, there was a change in Thomas. A quiet vigilance, a watchfulness born of experience. He'd learned that trust wasn't something to be given freely anymore. But he'd also learned that even when the world doubts you, truth, patient, steady, undeniable, has its own way of resurfacing. One evening, as the sun dipped low over Maple Ridge, Thomas sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and his laptop. The email inbox that had once been filled with complaints was now filled with inquiries, new tenants, referrals, and even a few letters from people who had seen his story online, thanking him for sharing it. Some were landlords who'd faced similar false accusations. Others were tenants who'd been unfairly treated by landlords. Each message carried the same undertone, gratitude for proof that fairness could still prevail. He decided to compile his experience into a series of articles for a property management journal, writing late into the night about transparency, documentation, and how easily small misunderstandings can spiral into destruction when fueled by ego and rumor. The writing felt therapeutic, each paragraph another layer peeled away from the pain that had once defined him. But even as he found peace, the memory of the tribunal day never fully left him. The way Rachel's confident smile had crumbled into panic, the way the truth had lit up the room, it replayed in his mind often. Not as vengeance, but as a reminder of what unchecked deceit could become. It also changed how he viewed justice. It wasn't the grand, dramatic moment people imagined. It was quiet, heavy, sometimes bittersweet. Because justice didn't erase the damage, it simply stopped it from spreading. As months passed, Thomas began volunteering with a small nonprofit that helped landlords and tenants mediate disputes before they escalated. He found a strange sense of purpose in it, helping others avoid the pain he'd endured. Sometimes he met people who reminded him of Rachel, defensive, manipulative, desperate for validation. Other times, he saw versions of himself, tired, disillusioned, barely holding on. To both, he offered the same advice. Document everything, speak calmly, and never let anger guide your decisions. Slowly, he rebuilt more than his business. He rebuilt trust, in himself, in the idea that even the most unfair battles can end with truth standing tall. A year later, the Maple Ridge Board sent him an official letter of apology for how his case had been mishandled at first. It was a small gesture, but meaningful. He framed it, not out of pride, but as a reminder that even institutions can learn. The neighborhood changed too. Where once gossip had ruled, now there was caution. People spoke more carefully, asked questions before believing rumors. The ordeal had left a mark on everyone, not just Thomas and Rachel, but the entire community that had been drawn into their conflict. One crisp autumn morning, Thomas walked past the apartment Rachel used to rent. The windows had been cleaned, the curtains replaced, a new family living there now. Children's laughter spilled into the street, replacing the tension that had once haunted that space. It struck him then, how time erases chaos the way waves smooth broken shells on the shore. Standing there, he realized something profound. The story had ended long ago, but its lesson would last. Not about punishment, not even about justice, but about the endurance of truth. Lies burn fast and bright. Truth smolders quietly, but it never goes out. That evening, Thomas sat by his window again, the same place he'd once stared out in despair. The sunset painted the sky in hues of amber and rose, the light spilling across the neighborhood he had almost lost. He thought about the journey, the humiliation, the sleepless nights, the quiet vindication, and understood that peace wasn't the absence of pain. It was what grew after surviving it. He opened his laptop and began writing one final message for the journal, his closing words simple yet weighty. In the end, justice is not about winning. It's about surviving long enough for the truth to be heard. He hit send, leaned back and closed his eyes. Milo settled beside him, resting his head on Thomas's leg. The air was cool, the world finally still. Across the street, a light flickered on in the new tenant's window, illuminating a quiet life beginning again where chaos once lived. And in that soft glow, Thomas felt a quiet satisfaction, not the thrill of victory, but the deeper calm of endurance. Because after all the noise, all the accusations, and all the pain, he had learned one undeniable truth. Justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't roar like thunder. It whispers, softly but surely, "You were right all along." And for Thomas Greer, that whisper was worth everything. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret, but remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.